Denmark isn't real. Or at least that's what it seems to be. In 1444, Denmark is in what seems to be a great position, at the head of the Kalmar Union, in a great trade node, and with decent expansion routes, assuming you can deal with the HRE. So why do they just kind of get tossed about by the great powers of Europe throughout the EU4 era and up to the modern day? What if, instead of dissolving, the Kalmar Union had stayed? What if the Danish had a series of great rulers that were able to tackle the geographical and political obstacles and launch Denmark to greatness? What if Denmark was real? This is the story we will explore today. This video will detail the rise of my trade-focused Danish kingdom, what I like to call trademark, over the first 100 years or so of the game. It will have heavy roleplay focus, much like my True Heir of Timur campaign from a few weeks ago. I do plan to get a few achievements in this one, but probably in the later game. Let me know if you guys like this video and would like to see a follow-up, or different campaigns like this, or other suggestions, of course, always welcome. Let's get to it. Christopher of Bavaria. It was no surprise that the son of German nobles, on both sides, would assume the Danish throne in 1440. His predecessor Eric had also been German, having descended from Pomeranian nobility. Christopher would be known as Christopher of Bavaria because of his dynasty, the von Wittelsbach's deep ancestral roots in Bavaria. But his father was from Neumark, and his mother from Pomerania. In 1441 he was elected in Sweden, and in 1442 in Norway. 1444 sees Christopher III working to cement his rule of Denmark and the wider Kalmar Union. The former King Eric leads a rebellion in Gotland. Both other members of the Kalmar Union, but especially the Swedish, chafe under Christopher's rule, and the Hansa cities grow even larger, exerting more and more influence that may serve to choke off Denmark's lifeblood of trade and commerce. Utilizing intelligence from a captured spy, the king goads Eric's rebels into attacking him near Going, and is able to crush the rebel army. He then travels to Gotland to capture Eric's last bastion and put an end to the rebellion to plant Eric back on the throne. Even as he is having Eric executed, Christopher begins preparations. He knows that the best way to distract his nobles, those in Denmark as well as Sweden and Norway, is to give them an offensive victory. The great King Valdemar II had once pushed into Estonia and supported the Baltic Crusades, but that land had since fallen under the control of the Livonian Order. With a naval expansion and the staging point of Gotland secured, Christopher sent word to his nobles to raise their levies and meet him there. And in January 1447 they set out to invade the Livonian Order. This invasion came as a surprise to the Livonians, but Christopher made it known that he was reclaiming his realm's rightful territory. And despite no love lost between the Danish and the Polish, he also cited the Teutonic Order's refusal to return control of certain lands to the Polish as further proof that the Holy Orders in the Baltics had overstayed their welcome. The naval battles in the Baltic Sea were intense. Although the Hansa remained officially neutral, one city, Riga, did support the Livonians openly, and it took quite the effort for even the newly expanded Danish navy to prevail. Eventually, the island of Østindisk was captured, then the fortress of Reval. With most of the Livonian Order occupied, Danish forces entered into the Teutonic Order, intent on forcing them into submission. With the expansion of the war into Teutonic lands, the Margrave of Brandenburg contacted the Danish crown, offering their assistance in exchange for a favorable peace treaty in which Brandenburg regained their lands from the Teutons, who they were having trouble negotiating a repurchase of said lands. Christopher had no large designs on Teutonic lands and so agreed. This would cement an alliance that, with few exceptions, would be one of the longest running and strongest in the world for the next few centuries. The war lasted over 3 years, and as the dust was settling, the Polish attacked the Teutons, finally pushing them to accept Christopher's armistice. Brandenburg would see the return of Neumark, the home of Christopher's father, John, as well as the transfer of the city of Danzig to the Danish control. The Livonians would cede a large swath of area in the north that Christopher would transfer to a vassal state of Estonia, and the Regans would pay an indemnity for their insolence, to be dealt with more harshly in the future. In one stroke, Christopher had radically altered the political situation in the north, much more to his favor. With the spoils of the war, he was able to pay off his pre-war debts, and the prestige of such a victory and their position now as one of the great powers of the known world secured the allegiance of the Norwegians and the Swedish in the near future. Unwilling to let go of the momentum, Christopher looked further to the east, namely to the merchant republic of Novgorod, and his hungry eyes settled upon the city of Neva. Within the year, Scandinavian armies with Christopher in the command pushed into the Republic, with the fortress of Novgorod itself falling in July 1451. Denmark took control of Neva and the rest of Novgorod's possessions along the coast of the Baltic Sea, and Christopher relished as he forced large sums of wealth out of Russia. This would start a trend that was oft repeated by Danish kings in the next few centuries. What followed was a brief period of peace. In 1454, Norwegian nobles came to Christopher with a petition for war against the Scottish. It seemed that a recent period of détente between the English and the Scottish was coming to an end, and the Earl of Orkney assured the king that if adequately reinforced by Danish forces, the Norwegians could claim a large section of northern Scotland. The English had been distracted in France and Ireland at the time, but made their distaste of the renewed Scandinavian presence in Britain known on the international stage. The peace treaty in September 1456 would see the Scottish relinquish the majority of the Highlands to the Norwegian crown, and pay reparations in excess of what was spent by the Kalmar Union on the conflict. A taste for profitable warfare now firmly ensconced in his psyche, Christopher longed for more. During this period, Christopher had worked to reduce the autonomy of the Hansa cities. Having captured Neva and Danzig, he refused to allow them to be re-established in such a manner, and he openly stated his intentions to incorporate Lübeck and Riga into the Danish crown on many occasions. After the incorporation of Holstein officially into the kingdom, and utilizing an arcane Estonian claim on the city of Riga, Christopher dispatched his navies and a hefty amount of troops to attack Riga and Lübeck in March 1459. This did not sit well with the Holy Roman Emperor, but as Christopher's main target had been Riga, not an official prince of the empire, the Austrian Frederick III was unable to garner enough support to come to the aid of the Hansa, and early Scandinavian victories on the seas and outside Riga and Lübeck kept many North German states out of the conflict as well. Lübeck would be occupied, and this occupation would not end after the war, effectively turning the city of Lübeck into a de facto Danish possession in defiance of Holy Roman law. The Regans would in fact last the longest, with the city falling in September 1462. During the Hansa War, Christopher's only son, whom his wife had requested they name Frederick, but due to his animosity towards the Holy Roman Empire he had chosen to name Christian, died before reaching his 6th year. Christopher had continued his wars after, but with a heavy heart. He incorporated the small remaining Livonian lands into Estonia, vassalized the remaining Teuton city of Königsberg, and beat back a Novgorod attack on Neva. On May 1st, 1467, with the possibility of having more children quite remote, Christopher acquiesced to his nobles and chose to officially name his eldest daughter, Margaret, as heir. Margaret was 13. Talented and ambitious, had she been a boy, her path to the throne would have been assured, but as a girl, it had always been in doubt. Christopher would spend the last few years of his reign laying the groundwork for her transition. Margaret, the ambitious. In the first years of her life, Margaret had been sheltered from the outside world. Living with her grandparents' family in Brandenburg for a time, she had been recalled to Denmark upon her brother's death and spent 6 long years wondering if her father would name her as heir. In her writings, Margaret painted a picture of her father as loving, seeking only to shield her from the responsibilities of rule in a world so harshly hostile to females in power. On January 20th, 1470, Christopher died in his sleep, and Margaret moved to take the throne. She was well liked, but despite this, Adolf Skram, a wealthy noble with ties to several Hansa cities, financed a rebellion, raising a near 26,000-man army and laying siege to Stockholm. In April, Margaret's first son, Karl, was born. It was not until September that Margaret's army would move to relieve the siege of Stockholm. On October 19th, Skram's army was defeated and driven into the sea. Skram himself was executed, and this helped cement Margaret's early reign. Taking a page from her father's playbook, Margaret spared little time, and at the end of the year, she authorized an attack on Scotland to commence on the 28th of December, 1470. The war should have lasted all of a year, with Lothian falling on December 18th, 1471. But Margaret chose to keep the conflict going, conquering all of Scotland. The resulting peace treaty would reduce Scotland down to a paltry few border provinces and greatly expand Norwegian, and therefore Danish, influence in Scotland. In 1477, after an incident where her official envoy to Moscow had been harassed and nearly killed on the order of the Muscovites, she called for the raising of the realm's armies to go teach them the error of their ways. Denmark's long-term ally, the Lithuanians, chose to lend their strength to the Scandinavian cause, and the Muscovites' even deeper loathing of the Lithuanians, as well as the realities of strategic positioning, would see a large portion of this conflict occur within the Lithuanian Grand Duchy. Then, in 1479, Even as the great clash was commencing, Margaret, in a move some would claim she had planned all along, chose this moment to attack the Polish and assert her now vassal of the Teutonic Order's claims to the Prussian lands. She knew that the Polish would not be able to call upon their sometimes ally of the Lithuanians, whom she had tied up fighting the Muscovites. A precursor to much more expansive conflicts in the next century, the inclusion of Polish and Muscovite allies from Mecklenburg to Ryazan would see upwards of 300,000 troops engage across a 1,500-mile distance, and conflict raging for the better part of a decade. In May 1482, the Polish would be the first to surrender, signing the Treaty of Ostrava, ceding the Polish lands back to the Teutonic Order, now under Danish control. But the conflict was a harrowing one, and had cost the Kalmar Union an entire generation of young men, as well as a mountain of treasure. The Lithuanians chose to exit the conflict even before the Polish surrender, proving their spineless nature, and despite the urgings of her commanders to push for final victory, Margaret chose instead to sting the Muscovites in a few key engagements, lay Moscow under siege, and then sign what amounted to a white peace with Muscovy in November 1483. The next few years were peaceful in Scandinavia. Margaret put down a number of rebellions and worked to further reduce the autonomy of some of the independent cities, moving to incorporate Lübeck into the Danish kingdom fully in 1482. A series of small conflicts would see the Danish capture the remaining cities under the control of the Scottish and the Novgorodians, after both those nations succumbed largely to attacks from England and Muscovy. Later, Danish forces would attack and subjugate the last few Irish counties outside of English rule, as Margaret contemplated if she would either escalate the conflict with London or with Moscow. She chose Moscow, and in June 1491, with a rump puppet state of Novgorod under her control, she attacked Muscovy, with the intention of, quote, returning the Principality of Novgorod to rightful rule and driving back the scourge of the East to Moscow. Much more successful than her previous attack on the Muscovites, this attack would see her forces drive back their forces in short order, and within 2 years, Moscow was in flames, and an armistice, returning nearly all of Novgorod's land, was signed. It was from this conquest that Margaret first began to be referred by her royal epithet as Margaret the Ambitious across Europe. As the century drew to a close, Margaret set out to vanquish her other great foe, the English, just as she had done the Muscovites, launching her attack in 1502 with the goal of pushing the English out of Scotland and possibly Ireland. The conflict took nearly 3 years to prosecute, and Margaret was enraged by the additional forces present due to large financial support from England's allies, including, most notably, Portugal. But in the long run, Danish forces in Ireland and Scotland would prevail, eventually pushing the English back to England, while other forces occupied English enclaves in France. Then an attack on London forced the signing of the peace treaty in which England left Scotland entirely, and was reduced to about half of Ireland. The English were humiliated, and Margaret had successfully bested both of her largest rivals. Queen Margaret had hoped the peace would last the remainder of her realm, when her nobles demanded that a territorial dispute along the border of the Teutonic Order and Poland be met with force of arms. This would, however, be Margaret's last conflict, and according to her writings, she felt deep sorrow that her armies, and those of up until recently her great ally of the Lithuanians, were forced to come to blows by the shifting winds of diplomacy. Margaret would pass quietly in the night on April 4th, 1518. One of her last official acts, securing an alliance with the French and the marriage of her son Hans to the French princess Adelaide de Valois, the last Wittelsbach king. Having been named heir after the disownment of his mentally challenged older brother Karl, Hans was poised to be a great leader of the Kalmar Union. He immediately reaffirmed his nation's allegiance to the Margrave of Brandenburg, helping them in their conquest of Brunswick and preparing for a conflict of his own, bringing his new wife's nation in on the conflict with the English in April 1520. In what some have theorized was a plot by French noblemen, Hans died suddenly in August 1520, leaving the Kalmar Union in the hands of one Christian de Valois, the older brother of Adelaide and a French duke. His position as heir to the Danish throne had been meant to be temporary until Hans and Adelaide had been able to conceive an heir, and the timing seemed suspect to many. Christian I de Valois. While inexperienced in administration, as he had been the titular Duke of Normandy under the French kingdom, a role without very many direct assets, not under control of the English enemy. Christian was a gifted diplomat, and the war with the English, a priority for both the Kalmar Union and France, was still raging, so Christian was able to keep the nobles in line for now. He personally led Danish and French armies in Iberia to punish the English allies of Castile and Portugal, even as a largely Norwegian and Swedish armies, along with Danish-backed Scottish mercenaries, tangled with the English. The Iberians would end up paying large indemnities to the Kalmar Union and France in exchange for their support of the English in this war, and Christian would even leave a permanent occupying army in Porto to dissuade the Portuguese from financing and supplying English forces in the future. In the final peace, England would relinquish all but the eastern holdings in Ireland and return the Duchy of Normandy to the French throne. The great victories of Margaret and later Christian would cement the power of the North in European politics, and also led credence to the Protestant Church. Margaret having converted, and thus converting her realms, beginning in 1516. In December 1527, the growing resistance to Christian's rule boiled over into open conflict. Count Christopher of Oldenburg, securing alliances from the mayors of Copenhagen and Malmö, intent on splitting from Denmark and establishment as Hansa trade cities, along with the dissonant and local nobles in Ireland and Scotland, and the ever-ready-to-resist nobility of Sweden, began a large-scale revolt that would become known as the Count's Feud. In early 1528, Clement Anderson, at the head of a noble army and later a peasant army, both defeated by Christian's forces, was eventually captured. Hailed initially as the end of the conflict, further uprisings proved that was not to be, and that the insurrection would last quite a while longer. Anderson was kept in prison until the actual end of the Civil War, and then executed by the breaking wheel. Over the next few years, Christian's forces put down rebellions in Denmark proper, as well as Ireland, Scotland, Norway, and even Iceland. The Swedes, for their part, only contributed money and men behind the scenes. Even though the conflict was still brewing, by 1531 Christian felt secure enough to attack the Muscovites on April 14th. It wasn't until a year later, April 13th, 1532, when the last of Count Christopher's holdout army was destroyed, and the Count himself was put to death alongside his greatest commanders. Copenhagen and Malmö were brought to heel, and Christian was now much more secure in his reign. The Muscovites would cede additional land in Denmark and Novgorod in March 1534. And after this war and the Count feud, the Kalmar Union was officially reorganized. The kingdoms of Denmark and Norway combined sat at its head, and the kingdom of Sweden officially inferior, but also above the high principalities of Novgorod, Scotland, Ireland, and the Teutonic Order. Attention then shifted back to the west. King Gaston de Valois of the Kingdom of France was 61 years old in 1536 when he died, and his 44-year-old second cousin proclaimed himself Louis XII. Christian de Valois called a council of his nobles. His own claim to the French throne was strong, and what's more, with their support, he would have the power to enforce it. Having just put down most of the disloyal subjects, Christian found his nobles amicable. On September 26th, Christian sent word to his third cousin Louis that he protested his place on the French throne, officially claiming it as his own. Louis brushed off Christian's proclamation, sent him a gift of ducats in honor of the Holy Roman Emperor's coronation, a blatant bribe in an attempt to keep Christian away. It didn't work. On December 3rd, Christian declared war on the Kingdom of France. The war would last 4 long years. Danish armies would march as far as Naples to bring French allies to task for supporting against Christian's claims. Eventually, the French armies would be defeated, and Paris captured after a long siege. However, Christian I would not see himself on the French throne. He died in February 1537, his claim passing to his young son, Christian II. And so, on May 29th, 1540, Christian II of Denmark would become Christian I of France, under a regency led by his mother, Maria von Corvey. That was when the troubles began. The Iron-Willed Queen. Christian II de Valois was 6 when he was thrust upon the French throne. He was undisputably the most powerful person in Europe, or at least his mother was. Even the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold VIII was terrified, but he was not alone. The sudden conquering of the French beast by an even more ferocious beast from the north had given pause to many of the empire's princes and a good number of other nations to the south. Queen Regent Maria Corvey and her noble council decided that an immediate attack on England would help to bind the loyalty of the French nobility and so set about planning such an attack, with the stated purpose of removing England from France and Ireland completely. Once again, this would draw the Kalmar Union into conflict in Britain and Iberia. This was when Leopold's coalition struck. Anchored by the Emperor's Duchy of Austria, the Kingdom of Hungary, they were supported by the majority of the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as a number of nations outside of it, most notably the Crown of Aragon. They declared war on the Kalmar Union in December 1540, even as Danish and supporting troops were sieging London and working to secure remaining English possessions on the continent. With very few exceptions, the majority of Europe was now at war, in what would become known as the War of the First Coalition. Upon their declaration against the English in 1540, the Kalmar Union had under its control approximately 197,000 men-at-arms. The English and her allies constituted 135,000 men in Britain and Iberia. The best numbers we have for the coalition forces are somewhat accurate estimates from March 1541, which places the whole of the coalition just shy of 400,000 men, at which time both the English alliance and the Kalmar Union had raised their troop counts as well to 145 and 242,000 respectively. All told, at this point, over 750,000 men were at arms in this conflict across Europe. Queen Regent Corvey proved herself up to the task, however, immediately cashing in every political and monetary favor the monarchy had to continue to raise troops, and tasked her nobles with the apt defense of the realm. Brandenburg, to her credit, stood firm in their defense and would pay dearly as Maria allowed them to be sieged, knowing that she must concentrate on the defense of Denmark itself and with France, and the quick resolution of the war with the English. Her eventual victory would gain her the epithet of the Iron-Willed Queen among the French and Scandinavians. But for this callous hanging out to dry of a long-term ally, the Germans would simply refer to her as that bitch. In the first year, the coalition forces pushed into Denmark and also occupied much of southern France. After the fall of London, Corvey hoped to sue for peace with the English late in the year. But the English knew if they held out, their foe would eventually be distracted. So they dodged official communications and kept their army mobile and away from Kalmar forces. Eventually, a large battle in Northumbria, the occupation of England's mainland assets, and a favorable peace deal offer from the somewhat humbled Corvey would bring them to the table. The peace with England was signed on December 11th, 1541. They weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. At this point, the Kalmar Union's forces amounted to nearly 250,000 men-at-arms, while the coalition could boast nearly 470,000. The numbers still approaching the 750,000 mark that they had begun with, despite the English and her allies dropping out. A testament to the growth of conscription during this war that would be the lasting impact on how wars were fought from this point forward. The disastrous Battle of Rethel in March 1542, where nearly 200,000 coalition troops beat about 140,000 Kalmar forces and resulted in some 65,000 casualties, was followed up by the nearly as devastating, at least to morale, Battle of Chartres, with a further 50,000 casualties. Corvey knew she would need a new tactic, and if they were to pull off a victory, it was going to be a close one. They were making some headway in the north, taking some of the small princes' forts and forcing them to leave the conflict one at a time. But it was slow going, and the coalition seemed to be growing every day. In April 1543, the Kalmar forces, no longer able to count Brandenburg among their allies, Brandenburg having to sue for peace late in the previous year, numbered only about 160,000 men, while the coalition could still call upon 400,000. It was looking quite bleak. But the Kalmar forces continued to resist. New conscripts and mercenaries were raised in Scandinavia and the Isles, and several small victories and close defeats in southern France helped to dispel the myth of coalition invincibility. During the conflict, the two main Kalmar armies became adept at navigating among a sea of hostile forces, hunting smaller isolated coalition armies, and using local numerical superiority to crush them quickly before moving out of the way of larger coalition forces. Although this would backfire on them occasionally, as in the major Battle of Bremen in March 1544, where Kalmar forces were forced to retreat in the face of overwhelming coalition reinforcements, but were still able to deal more than twice as many casualties to the coalition forces. Another near victory in the Second Battle of Chartres would see a 75,000 strong Hungarian army routed and another largely Austrian force nearly also beaten by a 50,000 strong Kalmar army. The coalition was beginning to show small cracks. After the Second Battle of Bremen in November 1544, the Kalmar forces were only down to 149,000 men, having lost a net of about 10,000, but the coalition sat at 335. Having lost a net of almost 70,000. Kalmar forces recaptured Chartres in late 1544 and Paris in early 1545, and made a concerted effort to threaten Bremen again in Third Battle of Bremen in February. Maria knew, though, that her nation was becoming exhausted, that despite all the losses, the combined coalition would eventually attrition them to death. So she ordered one last push into Lüneburg, forcing the coalition to lift their siege on Bremen, and during this period, the forces in France freed most of the important parts of the south. Maria then sent an envoy to the Duke of East Frisia, who had initially launched the conflict in the name of his lord, the Holy Roman Emperor. She demanded an end to the conflict and, quote, graciously allowed the coalition to face no indemnity, as their valiant armies had proved themselves most gallant. This, combined with the thinly veiled threat to burn down East Frisia itself, and the revelation that the Duke's sister and daughter were in Stockholm, having gone missing in East Frisia 6 months prior, the Duke acquiesced and agreed to white peace, notably without the consent of Emperor Leopold. The War of the First Coalition was at an end. And alas, this video must come to an end as well. I had a lot more that I wanted to put into this video, but it's getting really long and it's already going to be a day late. So I need to just get it out there so we can move on to other things. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down below. Constructive criticism, suggestions for more videos, those sorts of things are always welcome. If you'd like the video, subscribe, those sorts of things. That'll let me know that you like this, and then maybe we can do a follow-up. I'd love to take this campaign out further. There's a couple achievements I'd like to get, and those sorts of things. So let me know. Thanks for watching the video, especially all the way to the end. You guys are awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Oh, the truce with Austria. Coalition's forming up. And they joined. Ah, shit. Just all of Europe. No big deal, just all of Europe. I don't need this right now, France. You're gonna have to help. Why won't you die? This looks pretty bleak. I'm legitimately sweating. Ah, white peace. I was never worried. Not worried, not one bit. The great victories of Margaret and later Christian would cement the power of the North in European politics, and also lend credence to Protestantism. I can't fucking say that. Also led credence to Protestantism. Fuck, why can't I say that? The great victories of Margaret and later Christian would cement the power of the North in European politics, and also led credence to the Protestant Church. Margaret having converted, and thus converting her realms, beginning in 1516.